Welcome back to the Budding Author Podcast with me, your host, Simon Ward. Today we have author, editor, publisher, humorist, Annie Acorn. How you doing, Annie?
I'm doing fine. How are you today?
Oh, I'm good. We're keeping warm. It's a bit chilly, isn't it, at the minute? It's a
Yeah,
bit
we're having
chilly.
snowstorms here, so it's been a fun day.
Bring on the summer. Bring on the summer. I've just been talking to Kylie Keating, and she's in Spain, where it's nice and warm. But right then, into the action, as it were. Um, when did it all start for you? Writing?
When did my what? I'm sorry.
When did all your writing? When did you start
Oh,
writing?
when did I start writing? Well, I joke that some people are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. I was born with a pen in my hand. Really not too far off. I I was I knew how to write by the time I was 4. I grew up the first several years in one half of a duplex home with my grandmother and great aunt on one side and our family on the other. So I was a child with 4 adults, and they felt motivated to teach me how to read and write. Uh,
Oh, that's
First word I read was Westinghouse off the refrigerator door handle. Because it was right next to where I sat at the kitchen table as a child. So a bit unusual. And I had Horton Hatch's Who, or I think that was the title, memorized when I was 3. So I was very into stories, and I enjoyed learning to write, and I loved being read to, and was read to constantly.
yeah.
Remember vividly when I was probably in the 3rd grade, so I would have been about 7 years old. I had a spell where I would take a notebook and I would copy books that I had been read. Just copy them, just write the words. I have no
Right.
idea what
Right.
motivated me to do that, but I was doing that. And then very shortly, I was writing my own little stories. And I just kind of hid them away. I never said much about it, but there it was. And I was an avid reader. Mysteries, biographies, history, it didn't matter. In fact, one of my earliest jobs was my father liked to follow the stock market, and in the summers, he would pay me to record the stock market activity from the day before on graph paper for him while he was at work. And I was doing that from the Wall Street Journal. And I was 9 years old reading the Wall Street Journal cover to cover simply because it was written word.
Yeah.
There's real power in the words, and I think I realized early on I was more a creative person, and I think I really understood the communication value of the written word. In fact, I'm designing a new website right now, and I put a quote on there from John O'Donohue, an Irish poet and writer that who sadly we've lost now, but he writes about the word is, that the word is doesn't seem like much. It's very tight, just a tiny little splinter of language. But the greatest distance in the world is the distance between is and is not. And I think that is so typical of what a single word choice can do in a novel, a story, a description of a room,
I
anything.
think that's part of the challenge for me. I think when I'm writing a first draft, I do sort of get caught up in those words and making sure it's the right word. I think talking to some authors, it's like forget all of that, just write any rubbish down, sort of just to get the whole story written. Is that what your process would be?
I would say so. I was listening last night to your interview with Jen McLeod, and I was struck that we both approach it the same way. Now, that doesn't mean it's the best way. Everybody has their own ways, just like everybody organizes their desk differently. But both of us have an idea of the beginning and the end of the book, and a couple of bullet points along the way that we want to be sure happen to make the action flow correctly and the
Yeah.
story unfold properly. But then we pretty much let the characters write the story. And
Let
I
the
think
characters
that
take over.
brings reality to it. One of the writing tips that I tweet out regularly is always look at what you wrote the day before. Where did you leave your characters? What would be the next logical thing that the characters would now be doing, even ones that maybe we haven't seen briefly? Is this a point where you should bring someone back in? Just leave things as they are.
I think it's difficult sometimes. I think for me, you want to cover every element of the character. So like, but quite often you have a character that never eats anything. So
Right.
like, because
You
sitting
want to
down
be
and
very
having a meal,
careful. You don't want to go down rabbit holes. The critical thing is to make sure that everything you write is moving your story forward. Because if you
sitting
go
down
off
for
like a
dinner.
limb, if you head off, you can't easily get back in.
Yeah.
And not in a logical way, and not so your readers, because readers don't sit down and read the book straight through oftentimes. They can read a chapter a day when they're commuting. They can read a chapter on a Saturday and not have another chance to read until the next week. So you need to make sure that you haven't left them out in left field somewhere to where they're not going to be able to pick up where you are. And the most important single thing about writing a book is you never want to throw your reader out of the story, period.
Yeah.
You've got to keep them in there. You've got to keep them engaged.
Keep it tight. I think
It has to be
a lot of
action. I don't think it has to be action. I think it can be moving forward the love interest or the mystery component with a clue thrown in that sends messages, that sort of thing.
one of my focuses is pace. I read a lot of the things I read. There's so much exposition, so much description, and you lose sight of where you are with things. I like to keep the pace, keep everything moving along quickly.
And another thing I tweet always is dialogue is your friend.
Yeah.
And an author or writer's friend in multiple ways. One, dialogue will, if you just follow it along, just make it logical. Say it out loud as you're writing it. That helps. Make it a verbal that you're doing. How would you respond to that? And just write whatever first comes to your mind. And you can very quickly fill the page with dialogue.
Yeah.
That keeps you from getting lost in description of, the lamps and the curtains and the paint on the wall and, the art and all that's important. I also tweet, if you're knowledgeable about theater, art, music, insert it, because it gives a richness to your characters. It helps you to make them three-dimensional. If one of them plays a piano or another one, maybe is a baker or whatever, you can make that character more three-dimensional and more relatable by doing that sort of thing. But you have to contain and control. However, that having been said, all of that having been said, in answer to really your base question, is you never have to contain and control that in your first draft.
Yeah.
No one is going to read your first draft long term. Hopefully. I don't think anybody. They say Ernest Hemingway just wrote his books and never went back. But Ernest Hemingway had an old style editor who spent months cleaning up his books.
Yeah.
We have to write our books, rewrite our books, maybe rewrite them again, then begin layers of editing. And one thing about editing is we have story arcs within a chapter from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And you've got to make sure that that's developmental editing. Are all those story arcs tied up by the end of the book?
Yeah.
They logically go up here with a character and come down here. Did you finish them? Or did you just leave a hanging chad, as we would say in the U.S. from one of our previous elections, hanging, that leaves something. In fact, I can look over here at a little bookcase, and I have a series of, I guess it's about a dozen books, mysteries that were written in the 1920s. And I bought them at a used bookstore. And I love those books because the man who originally owned them wrote in pencil his name in the beginning of the books, and I feel like I'm reading the books with him because during the books, he literally, with a pencil, was writing, what about this? What about that? And at the end of every book, and they're well-written mysteries, I thoroughly enjoy reading them, but in full length. At the end of every book, he put 1. What about this? 2. What about this? 3. What about this? And that,
particularly with mysteries, yeah.
right, and that taught me the importance to a reader that I've never even met, never will met, who's probably long gone by the time I even bought the books, to how important it was that these hanging little things, these story arcs, be completed. The one possible exception is if you're writing a series, but I think you have to be very careful. It's a very fine line, because there are people who will never read a series because they feel like they're being forced to buy 4, 5, 6, 10 books. And they really want that. They want to buy the first book and read a book. And then they may or may not buy the second book. And they want to pick up the third book when it's in a bookstore or you're tweeting and launching it. And they want to know that they can pick that book up and without maybe even having read book number 2, logically understand and follow the book from day one. And I write 2 series, and that's the hardest part of it, is making sure that each book is as standalone as it possibly can be.
Yeah.
And neither one of them did I really perceive day one were going to be series. The Captain's Point, when I had a vision it could go that way, but I originally thought I was going to write a mystery and ended up with romance. So what did I know? My characters obviously knew more. But the Midnight Cabin series, I never thought I'd write but 1 story. And now I have many stories and books out there. So
what's been your biggest seller, would you say, at the moment?
Your
biggest, from a sales perspective, what has been your most successful book?
Oh, my most successful book would be Chocolate Can Kill.
Chocolate Can Kill.
Right. That's a cozy mystery novel. Interesting story there if you want me to go down that rabbit hole. I can.
Where I was going to go with that, where in the amount of books that you've done, where does that fall on your...
That was the first one I published.
Oh, the very first one should be your biggest seller?
Oh. The very first one. I published it. It was a Malice Domestic Contest finalist, which is a huge international mystery writing contest St. Martin's Press does every year. Readers in the UK may know St. Martin's Press because they were the ones that launched the James Herriot books. In fact, the James Herriot books saved St. Martin's Press back in the day from bankruptcy, when major traditional publishers on this side of the Great Pond were going out of business in droves. 50% of them did go out of business in that period. So go James Herriot. But anyway, there are 6,500 contestants each year for that. What they do is they publish the winner. And I was a finalist, which was 10 out of 6,500. And it was very frustrating. Well, I was as shocked as everybody else. But anyway, I was thrilled, but it was, you go in there to learn from the experience more than you do thinking you're going to win. And, but it didn't win. And the judge I had at the time was very upset by that. She had at that point picked 14 out of 18 of the winners, the complete winners. And she felt it should have been the winner that year. She read all of the others. And she said, I'm going to be honest with you, and I want you to know this. They would publish it today if you would change the main character. And she was a 50-year-old woman, and they wanted her to be 26 or 28 years old. She didn't think she'd be marketable. And so I tried to get an agent. I made one stab, had an agent say she wanted it, and then she emailed me back 3 days later and said, I'm sorry, I've decided to no longer represent writers of cozy mysteries. I'm going to go and now solely focus on representing writers of erotic fiction. So, okay, fine. That was a little stretch for Chocolate Can Kill, although I will say it has received a very bad review from a woman who really criticized the sex scenes in it, which I found very interesting because Chocolate Can Kill has no sex scenes in it at all. but apparently I didn't do well with them.
Well, maybe they were complaining that there weren't enough, perhaps.
Right. So I'm an out of the box thinker, and I have owned several businesses. And I realized at the time, because we're talking 2011 and 12, that ebooks were coming in a big way. And the whole industry was changing dramatically.
Yeah.
Our traditional publishers were backing away from paying for you to go on marketing trips and going to conventions and all of this. And I learned more about how long it took for you to get your royalties. A year before you saw your next royalties after in advance. How small your royalties were compared to what you get if you indie publish over here. And in the course of trying to set myself up to be able to perhaps go that self-publishing route, I realized that there was a lot of technical knowledge you needed to have to really effectively do it back then. Now there are a lot of people out there that you can go to Fiverr and get people to format a book. You can go many places and get relatively inexpensive.
I find Readsy is very useful.
Right. There's plenty. I mean, there's just tons of stuff out there now. They were not there in 2012.
No.
So I had a friend who was technically knowledgeable. He'd been saying, you really need to be doing this. I want to use the technical knowledge. I don't have anything to use it around and with. I don't have any product. You probably have several stories sitting aside. And I said, I have 2 file cabinets full. He said, what are you waiting for? So he came over, and 2 writers that I was in a group with came over, and he helped us set up websites and got us going on Twitter. And, and I realized in the course of that afternoon, probably because of the quantity of peanut M&Ms I had consumed, that we really, that there was a business opportunity there.
Yeah.
A successful business will usually fill a hole, okay? And I realized there was a hole. So I decided to open Annie Acorn Publishing. And Chocolate Can Kill was certainly not the first thing I published. In fact, I published a little children's book that I had written. But, and I published other people's work before I published Chocolate Can Kill. But April 1st of 2012, and we opened Annie Acorn Publishing, became an LLC in August of 2011, so the previous year. We launched Chocolate Can Kill. And I had virtually no social media presence. I had maybe 1,200 followers on Twitter. I had maybe, and this is probably way more than I had, 500 friends on Facebook, which was more active back then. And I was sitting here in my living room behind me with one of the authors editing her children's book on April 22nd, 22 days after launch. And I said, let me go in and just see how Chocolate's doing. And I went into Barnes & Noble's dashboard, and I could literally see the number of books sold turning over. And that day, I sold 1,200 copies of Chocolate Can Kill.
Nice.
Book that St. Martin's Press had said couldn't possibly sell because Emily was a middle-aged woman.
Yeah.
Selling like hotcakes. And within a week, it was #1 on the Barnes & Noble website. And not just a genre, the entire website. And it was beating out James Patterson, Yankovic. There were 6 or 7 highly traditional published mystery authors who were on the first 2 pages of what would pull up Cozy Mystery. And within the following week, I was #1 on Amazon in theirs. And I had basically followed to market it, thankfully, what an author named John Locke had presented to the public in a small book. And he was the first person to sell 100,000 ebooks on Amazon back in the day. That's where we were. And he was written up in the Washington Post and all sorts of places. And he had 5 basic points that he made in his book. One was you had to write a great book, which he defined not as a great American novel, not as War and Peace. You had to write a book that many people would want to read and many people would enjoy reading, which sort of ties back to a very standard writing tip: write what you would want to read. And basically is saying you need to, your first book to get you to become a known author needs to either be a genre fiction book that you would want to read that's widely marketable, or if you're writing nonfiction, it needs to be one that's really going to fill a hole. Okay, like I have a real estate book that's how to survive a 203K mortgage, which is a specialized mortgage that allows you to get a mortgage for a flip home, basically,
Yeah.
to buy, have the mortgage, but also the money to fix the home. And there's a certain path you have to go down to make it work. And I had enough knowledge that I was able to write a book. And now I have realtors that are buying it 20, 25 copies at a time to hand out to their clients to get them to go this route and buy a house.
Yeah.
But anyway, you had to write a good book. The second thing you needed to do was to develop a social media presence. And at the time, it's Twitter and Facebook that he was promoting. Well, I was doing that as rapidly as I could, but it was taking time. Then you had to have a website, which we had done. And he said you needed a blog, was number 4, but you didn't need to blog every week. You didn't even need to blog every month. He was blogging about once every 3 months. But you needed to have a blog that you could put out on social media, and you could bring people, and this was the next step, back into your website where you prominently displayed your book cover and a blurb and information so that they could punch on it and go through to a buy page. And one thing I added to that as I developed Twitter was I had written a humorous blog post based on a true event, which was really very funny. And I would, when someone followed me on Twitter, I would send them in my stream, not a DM, which people ignore and feel like you're pushing them to buy something. I sent them a reply tweet in my stream that said, "Thank you for your follow. I followed you back." If I could see in their bio they were a writer, I would say, "Best wishes for your hashtag WIP, work in progress. Here's a read on me." And then I would put hashtag humor, hashtag am writing. And at the end of every tweet, I put a colon, a hyphen, and a parentheses mark, rather even today than the icon that now exists.
Yeah, I'm doing that, yeah.
But that's become known as a sort of icon for me as well. And because it was humor, because it was free, because it was in their stream, and because it really was funny, at the time, the analytics in the back of WordPress was extremely accurate. And very quickly, in about, I'd say by the end of that summer of 2012, that blog post, which had the link for chocolate right at the top and a link for Murder with My Darling down at the bottom, that one blog post had been retweeted 14,000 times. And then, of course, it didn't track that someone then retweeted it out there in the ether. I have no doubt millions of people saw those tweets. I mean, because and that just continued to generate sales. And St. Martin's, you were very, very wrong. Because Cutting Kill, it sells every month and still does. And this is what,
having that great success there. When you're writing now, are you worried that perhaps you won't reach the same heights? Or
I don't care if I reach the same heights, honestly. I mean, that sounds maybe like I'm just saying it, but that's true. I mean, it was wonderful. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I was thrilled when I paid off my car loan, really quickly, in about 2 months. I was like, oh boy, this is great. But I knew that, Margaret Mitchell, was a one novel writer, but Gone with the Wind was certainly a classic.
Yeah.
But I knew it might never happen again. I mean, I was old enough, I knew that. But I've been very lucky, and I've done a number of things over the years, just partly as a business owner, partly as a writer, partly because it just made common sense. One of the things I did, that I'm very glad I did was as we developed Annie Acorn Publishing, I was aware that Charles Dickens in the 1880s did something really out of the box for the time. Um, the Christmas Carol is one of the outputs of that, although he primarily wrote it so he could do a one-man show. And there's a gentleman here in the U.S. that still does that, and that's a almost 30,000 word novella. So to memorize that and get out on a stage in a small circle kind of theater and do the whole thing is incredible to see. I've seen it several times. I'd go see it again. But what Dickens did was every Christmas he would put together a magazine and put it out. At one time thing, it wasn't serialized, and he'd do one usually every year. And back then, what they generally, the stories in them generally were like ghost type stories, because after church Christmas Eve, you sat in front of the fire and you told ghost stories, was sort of the tradition in a lot of British homes. But what he did that was out of the box was he'd have 10 or 11 authors, and at the time, 4 to 5 of them were women, which was very unusual. It gave these women, and some of them went on to be very prolific authors at the time, but it gave them a shot in their own names to publish and get serialized in regular magazines that were out there at the time. But we did the same thing and published every year in Annie Acorn's Christmas Treasury. And those were very well received. People liked having a collection of short stories from a variety of authors. We sold a lot of their other books because, people got to see their work, and we had a listing of their novels and whatever in the back of the book. And those sold every year and every month of the year, which really, really surprised us.
That's good stuff. I'll move on to a new question for you.
Okay.
Procrastination. Are you too busy for procrastination, or is that a big problem for you?
It could be. I have referred to myself as the queen of procrastination. I have overcome it, not easily, but what I do, and I even did this with work, I started this years ago when I was still working, is at the end of every day, I would make on a small, not big legal pad, just a tiny one, a to-do list for the next day. And I didn't do it in the computer because I really wanted it visual on the desk when I came in the next morning. Now I leave it on top of the computer. And I always do it in a way that I only have, got a little thing coming up here, I only have maybe 5 to 6 items on it. What I could realistically even hope and pray to get done within the next day. And my rule is when I go in the next morning, I have to start with the one that's going to take the most time.
Well, I do the end up
I know, because it gives you a sense. But what happens with me is that long time one just moves forward, and then it moves forward again, and sometimes it's the most critical one, and it's going to hold other ones back down the road. So that's how I broke it. It's just a habit. When you do something for 3 weeks, it becomes a habit, and that really can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think having that to-do list, and then obviously attempting to get through the whole of the to-do list each day. But I am guilty. I think if I've got a chapter or something I want to write, I will do everything else on my list before I can get comfortable to sit down and do that.
Really?
Yeah, I need to have everything else done. I need to have all the other little bits done before I can really concentrate on doing the writing.
Well, if it's going to keep your mind from being focused, you've almost got to do it,
I need to. I can't just sit down for an hour and write. I need to like a good 4 or 5 hours.
If you need to get a doctor's appointment made, you need to make that a first call. I mean, because otherwise you'll be in line for a year. But no, I do that. Another thing I do that is maybe a little different than what a lot of people would recommend. I am not a person who wants to go back and edit and go back and edit and go back and edit. I think a lot of people get writer's block because they think that what they've written isn't any good and they get stuck on that. But when I go in to write, the first thing I do is I go back I don't necessarily read the whole chapter ahead. Often my chapters will have sections in them. I will read the last section through so that I can, and if I see something obvious, I'll fix it. But I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm just trying to get back into the flow of the last words I wrote.
Yeah.
And then what logically comes next is my question, even if I have some idea of where I want to go. And sometimes a character will surprise me and they'll raise their hand and they'll go, hey, what about me? He said that, and I need to come in and somehow address that, And so I make it get shifted. But reading that gets me in the flow of the cadence and flow of the words I was writing, and just that logical bit. And then I do something Jen mentioned in her podcast that you did. I make myself write a first sentence because the first sentence is the worst one. As a creative, when you get that first sentence on the paper, another one's going to pop into your brain. It just is.
Yeah.
It may not be good. It may be very bad. It may not even be logical. It may not be one you want to keep, but it will come. And that's what will get you going.
Yeah.
And then you kind of pick up steam, and pretty soon you're just in the zone, or I am. I mean, it works for me. I don't know.
Well, I think it's the same for me. I think if it's been a while since I've written anything, I'll go back and I'll probably spend like half an hour reading what I've been. I'll probably read a chapter before,
Right.
or maybe a couple of chapters, just to sort of get myself back into it. You've got to get back into the flow to keep the as you say, keep the cadence correct, haven't you?
Because it's important to get back in the voice you're writing that book in. Different books you write with different voices.
Yeah.
Because the characters can really determine. I mean, if you were writing a film noir kind of book, you'd want that strong footsteps on the hot black top of the road, kind of feel.
Yeah.
But you don't want that if you're having a proposal scene by a flowing river. They're completely different books. And the same author might be writing different ones. Another thing that I find is if you go in there and you just can't get into that next chapter. Maybe you're unsure of exactly how you really want to write. Where do you want to go? One of the things I tweet, and I write on every book, every story is on one Word doc. I don't do a Word doc for each chapter. Okay, I started that way. Eventually, I had to put it all in one. Well,
No, I just have one. I just keep
you
going.
might as well do it all in one. But one thing you can do, sometimes you'll find with writer's block that what is keeping you, well, it can be, I think, two real things. One is that you're trying to force a character to do something you've written them so they would never do. Work, okay? So you have to go back and maybe rethink what you're doing. But the other is you've got something that you're really excited about writing ahead that's just pushing to come out of you. Go ahead and drop down half a page and write that day. Don't worry about writing the next one. And a lot of times that really helps you because now you know where you are and you know where you want to go. And that helps you to connect those dots. And if I even come up, sometimes at night I'll wake up with something, I'll write that. I'll write when I'm watching TV, I always have a notebook next to me. I'll write maybe a paragraph or two or maybe a page and a half of something in the book. The next morning I will also do that. I will sit down, open the Word doc, and I will put them sequentially beneath where I am, flowing through the book. And I will color code each individual section differently so I know and get them in somewhat order of where I think they would logically flow within the book. And then I'm writing toward already written material. And boy, when you hit that already written material and you think you're going to go in there and write 1,000 words and you've got all this stuff in it, all you're doing is time. And at the end of the day, you've written like 1,200 or 1,000 or 5,000 words. That's incredible. And I have
I think I had that with one of my characters was arrested, and the details of what would happen within that, I just hadn't got all the information with me to do that, so I just parked that, and then I continued thereafter, and then did my research another day, and then went down and wrote that bit to fill that gap in.
Right, right.
Just keep the flow going when you're writing. You got to keep the flow, haven't you?
Absolutely, and that's the key.
Time is precious.
You want to move forward, you know.
Yeah.
You want to get going. I have one book that I'm so glad. Sometimes you just like the characters can take you over, a storyline can take you over. Okay.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen often. Characters are much more likely to show up and be pushy, particularly male characters in romance novels. They wake me up in the middle of the night and say, "You've got to go write this chapter." And okay, and no sleep that night. But that's A Man for Susan, which is the second book in the Captain's Point series.
Yeah.
And I knew it starts with a wedding and then it ends with a wedding. And I knew that was going to happen. Okay. And I knew the wedding it was going to end with, it's based on the actual wedding of my maid of honor years ago, which I loved. It was a beautiful outdoor, little, very tiny, intimate wedding. And that's what I wanted for this couple. And it fit into the story. And I woke up, actually, we had a Monday after Easter off here, sort of like a Boxing Day after Christmas over there this one year. And I woke up that morning. I had nothing going on. I had time. I didn't want to tweet and stuff because it was a day everybody was off. And I thought, okay, I'll just sit down and I'll write a little on A Man for Susan. And I had written about 7 chapters of it at the time. And I want to say it's like 19 chapters long. And I had some bits and pieces, writing down. But I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go in there and I'm going to write the wedding at the end because I know exactly what I want to do.
Yeah, it's good to do
I
that.
went all the way down to the bottom. I wrote that chapter. It was exactly what I wanted it to be. Well, then I knew exactly what I wanted to write for the chapter before. And I just kept going and going and going and going. Backwards. I wrote the whole rest of that book backwards in 16 hours.
I think it just goes to prove that there are many methods you can use.
I'll never do that again, and I don't recommend it to anybody. Okay, I'm just saying it doesn't hurt to go forward, and it can really excite you.
Yeah.
I'm a little crazy. I'm kind of sorry you're going to put this out. You might want to edit that.
But I think we better sort of tie up there. I'm wary of timing. We're definitely going to have you back on. I think
thank you.
You've got some great stories and some great advice, and we need to tap into that a little bit more. And I think for our next conversation, we'll maybe about AI or something like that, and see what we get you on that. But I am wary of time. So thank you very much for coming on, and we'll definitely have you back on, Annie. It's been a pleasure.
It'd be an honor to be here.
It's all great. Thank you. For everybody watching, thank you very much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and follow all these wonderful journeys that we're sharing. Thanks for watching.